the first time I caught my stepmother trying to reset the password on my bank account. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I sat down at my father's kitchen table, folded my hands the way they teach you to stand at ease. And I waited because I already knew something they didn't. The army doesn't just deposit money into my account every month. DeWitt deposits it for reasons neither of them had bothered to ask about in 15 years. And before that week was over, my father would finally learn exactly why the government trusted me with more than he ever had. My name is Jennifer Hayes. I'm 35 years old, and I hold the rank of Lieutenant Colonel in the United States Army. I've spent the better part of my adult life in places most people can't find on a map doing work. I can't always talk about coming home to a country that changes a little more every time I blink. 2 weeks ago, I finally got leave. 14 days. No deployments, no briefings, no boots hitting gravel at 4 in the morning. Just quiet. I flew into Charlotte on a Tuesday afternoon, and my father picked me up at the airport with that same crooked smile he's had since I was a kid. The one that used to mean everything was going to be okay. I should have known better than to trust a smile that easily. My mother died when I was 22, right before I commissioned. Cancer took her fast, faster than any of us were ready for. 2 years later, my father married Linda. I didn't hate her for it. Grief does strange things to people, and I understood or told myself I did that he needed someone. What I didn't expect was how quickly Linda would start treating my life like a resource to be managed. The truth is, I've never asked my family for a dime. Not for college, not for my first car, not when I was scraping by on a lieutenant's salary in a one-bedroom apartment with a mattress on the floor. I built what I have with my own hands, my own discipline, my own sacrifice. That independence is the one thing in this world that's entirely mine. So, when I walked through my father's front door that first evening, suitcase still in hand, and Linda's first words to me weren't, "Welcome home," but, "So, how big was the bonus this time?" Something in my chest went very still. I laughed it off, told her it was classified, which wasn't even a joke. Not really. She laughed too, but it wasn't a real laugh. It was the laugh of someone filing information away. That night over dinner, I noticed things I hadn't let myself notice before. Linda asked about my base pay like she already had a number in mind. She mentioned my hazard pay almost casually, the way you'd mention the weather. She knew about my TSP contributions. She knew about a savings account I hadn't touched in 3 years. These weren't guesses. These were facts, specific, accurate facts that I had never once discussed with her. I looked at my father. He was cutting his chicken eyes down, saying nothing. "Family should share what it has," Linda said, reaching for her wine glass like she'd just stated something as obvious as the sky being blue. "That's what family does, Jennifer." I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. 12 years in the military teaches you that you don't let your face give away what your training is screaming inside. "I don't disagree with that, Linda," I said. "But sharing implies I know what's being shared, and with who." She smiled at me the way you'd smile at a child who just said something cute and slightly naive. My father still didn't look up. That was the first time I understood. Really understood that something had been happening in this house, long before I walked back through the door. Something patient, something that had been building itself quietly, brick by brick, while I was overseas doing a job that didn't leave room to look over my shoulder at home. Later that night, I couldn't sleep. Jet lag, maybe. Or maybe it was the small cold feeling sitting in my stomach. The same feeling I get in the field, right before something goes wrong before you can even name what it is. I opened my banking app out of habit more than suspicion, just to check the balance the way I always do. And there it was, a login alert, then another. Multiple attempts spread across the last several weeks from a device I didn't recognize at hours. I would have been asleep or on duty. I sat there in the dark guest room of my father's house, the phone glowing in my hands, and felt something shift inside me. Not panic, not yet. Something colder, something more useful than panic. Because if there is one thing the Army trained into me better than marksmanship, better than leadership, better than any tactical skill I carry, it's this. When you find the first data breach, you don't react, you investigate. You gather everything. And then when you're ready, You close the door so completely that whoever tried to get in never finds a way back inside. I set the phone down on the nightstand, and for the first time since I'd landed, I let myself really look at my family. Not the family I remembered, but the one that had grown quietly into something I no longer recognized. I didn't say anything to my father or Linda. The next morning, I made coffee, ate breakfast, let the conversation drift toward safe, easy things, the weather, my flight, whether I wanted to go to the lake house that weekend. I smiled in the right places. I asked about Linda's garden. I have spent my entire adult life learning how to keep my face calm, while my mind runs 100 scenarios at once. And that morning, sitting at my father's table, with my coffee going cold, I ran every one of them. Because the thing about growing up is that you start to remember conversations differently once you have a reason to look back at them. I thought about the year I turned 26 right after my mother passed, and before Linda had fully settled into the house. My father had come to me with a folder of papers, my birth certificate, an old savings bond, a copy of my social security card. "Let me hold on to these for you," he'd said. "You're always moving around with the army easier if they stay in one place." I was young. I was grieving. I said yes without thinking twice, because it was my father asking, and there wasn't a version of that man in my head capable of doing me harm. I hadn't thought about that folder in nearly a decade. That afternoon, while Linda was out at what she called her book club, though I never once saw her carry an actual book to it, I asked my father casually if he still had my old paperwork somewhere. He hesitated just long enough for me to notice it, then said it was in the office in the bottom drawer of the filing cabinet. I found it exactly where he said it would be. But it wasn't just my papers anymore. There were photocopies I didn't remember making. There was a printed bank statement from an account I'd closed years ago, one I was certain I'd never given anyone access to. There was a sticky note in handwriting that wasn't my father's with a string of numbers on it that took me a full minute to recognize as part of my old account writing information. I stood in that office with the folder in my hands, and I felt something in me go very quiet, very focused the way it does right before I walk into a briefing where the stakes are higher than anyone in the room is willing to admit out loud. I didn't confront anyone that day. I've learned in more contexts than I can count that confrontation without evidence is just noise. And noise gives the other side time to clean up before you understand the full shape of what you're dealing with. So instead, I went upstairs to the guest room, opened my laptop, and I got to work the way I would on any operation. I changed every password, not just the obvious ones, my checking account, my savings, but the recovery emails attached to them, the security questions, the two-factor authentication numbers. I called my bank's fraud line, sitting on hold for 40 minutes with my knees bouncing under the desk, and I asked them to flag my account for any future access attempts, no matter how legitimate they might look on paper. I requested a full login history going back 6 months. While I waited on hold, I found myself staring at an old photo on the nightstand my mother, and me taken maybe 2 years before she died, both of us laughing at something outside the frame I could no longer remember. I wondered, not for the first time that week, what she would have said if she could see who my father had let into our lives, and what that person had been quietly doing with what was left of mine. The bank representative finally came back on the line with information that confirmed what I already suspected in my gut. There had been 3 attempts in the last 2 months to verify identity on my account using personal information that matched details only someone close to my family would know: my mother's maiden name, my childhood address, the name of my first pet. None of the attempts had succeeded. My security settings put in place years ago out of habit more than fear had held, but someone had tried multiple times and they hadn't stopped trying. That evening at dinner, Linda brought up her car again, the one she'd been talking about since I arrived, a newer model she'd seen at a dealership downtown. She mentioned it the way people mention things they've already decided are going to happen, just waiting for the right moment to make it official. "It would really help us out," she said, cutting a piece of pot roast with more focus than the topic required. "Your father's truck is getting old, too, and with the credit card balance where it is right now, Honestly, we could use a little breathing room." She looked at me when she said it. Not at my father. At me. "You don't have kids to worry about," she added almost gently, like she was doing me a favor by pointing it out. "It's not like the money's going anywhere important." I smiled. It wasn't a warm smile, and I didn't try to make it one. "That's an interesting way to think about my life, Linda," I said. My father laughed nervously, the way he does, when he wants a conversation to move past something uncomfortable without actually addressing it. Linda didn't laugh. She just watched me, waiting to see if I'd offer something more. I didn't. I finished my dinner, thanked Linda for cooking, and excused myself early, telling them jet lag was still getting to me. It wasn't a lie exactly. I was tired, but not from the flight. I was tired from realizing fully and completely that the woman sitting across that table had spent years building a plan around my paycheck, my sacrifices, my years overseas, and that my own father had either helped her do it or had simply never cared enough to notice. Upstairs, I lay in the dark and thought about all the missions I'd run, where the hardest part wasn't the danger. It was the waiting, watching, gathering intelligence, letting the other side believe they had the advantage right up until the moment they didn't. I closed my eyes and told myself the same thing I tell every soldier under my command before something difficult. Patience isn't weakness. Patience is how you win. 3 days later, my phone rang while I was out running along the greenway near my father's neighborhood. The kind of run I take to clear my head, to remember what my own breathing sounds like without gunfire or engine noise underneath it. The number on the screen belonged to my bank's fraud department. I slowed to a walk, my heart already picking up, for reasons that had nothing to do with the run. The woman on the line was polite, professional, the way people trained to deliver bad news carefully always are. She told me there had been another attempt to access my account that morning. This time, a call placed directly to customer service. Someone claiming to be me, asking to reset my online banking credentials and add a secondary user to the account. The security questions they'd answered correctly were unsettling in how accurate they were. But the final verification step, the one I'd added weeks ago after my first suspicions, was a code sent only to my personal device. Whoever had called didn't have it. The request failed, but they had a recording of the call, and when the representative offered to email it to me, I told her yes. Immediately, my legs still moving beneath me on autopilot while my mind went somewhere very still and very cold. I listened to that recording standing in my father's driveway, sweat cooling on my skin sunglasses, hiding my eyes from anyone who might have been watching from a window. It was Linda's voice. Unmistakably, Linda's voice, warm and confident, explaining to the representative that she was helping her stepdaughter, who travels constantly for work, get her account back in order. I walked into that house within 10 minutes. Linda was in the kitchen wiping down the counter, and when she looked up and saw my face, something flickered across hers too. Not guilt exactly, something closer to irritation, like I'd interrupted a task she considered perfectly reasonable. "I got a call from my bank," I said, keeping my voice level, the way I would with a soldier who'd just made a serious mistake in the field. "Someone tried to add themselves to my account this morning." Linda set down the dish towel with a little too much precision. "I was just trying to help," she said. "You're gone so often, Jennifer. Someone needs to keep an eye on things while you're overseas. Who gave you permission to call my bank?" "I'm your father's wife," she said, like that phrase alone should have answered every question I could ever ask. "Money in this family is shared. That's how families work." "That's not how my money works," I said. My father walked in at that exact moment, drawn by the tension in the room, the way people are always drawn to a fight they'd rather not be part of. He looked between us and I watched him do the thing he always does. Soften the moment, smooth it over, protect the peace of the house instead of the truth inside it. "Come on now," he said. "There's no harm done." Linda was just trying to help out. Something in me went very quiet then. The particular quiet that comes right before I stop asking questions and start giving orders. "No harm done," I repeated. "Dad, someone called my bank pretending to be me. That's not helping, that's fraud." "That's a strong word," he said, his voice tightening. "It's the accurate word." Linda crossed her arms, tilting her chin up in that way people do when they've decided they're the ones being wronged. I raised you for 15 years, Jennifer. I think I've earned a little trust. I felt something shift behind my ribs. Something that had been building quietly since the moment I found that folder in my father's office, since the login alerts, since every small patient overreach I'd chosen to notice instead of ignore. I stood up straighter the way I do when I address a room of people who need to understand immediately and without ambiguity that the conversation has changed. Dad, I said, looking directly at him, clear's throat, my voice steady in a way that made both of them go still. Do you know why the army pays me? The kitchen went silent. Even the refrigerator seemed to hum a little quieter. My father blinked, caught off guard by the question, the way people always are when you ask them something they assumed they already understood. Because you're an officer, he said slowly. Because of your rank. No, I said that's not why. Linda opened her mouth to say something. Some deflection, some small dismissive comment designed to shrink the moment back down to a size she could manage. I held up one hand, not aggressively, just enough to stop her before she started. I need you both to actually hear this, I said. Because I don't think either of you understands what you've been trying to take a piece of. My father's face had gone pale. The kind of pale that comes when a person realizes too late that a conversation they thought they controlled has already slipped entirely out of their hands. I took a breath, the kind I take before walking into a room where the outcome matters more than my own comfort, and I began. I didn't raise my voice. I've never needed to raise my voice to make people understand that a line has been crossed. Volume is what people reach for when they don't trust their own words to carry weight. I trust mine. The army doesn't pay me because I'm your daughter, I said, looking at my father, my voice even and unhurried. It doesn't pay me because of a last name, or because someone in this family decided I owed them something. It pays me because I earned every single dollar of it, in places neither of you will ever have to think about. My father opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Linda's arms were still crossed, but her posture had changed slightly, the confidence in her shoulders thinning out just a little. You want to know what that money represents? I asked, and I didn't wait for an answer, because this wasn't really a question. It represents 4 deployments. It represents birthdays I missed mine and other people's. It represents Christmas mornings spent in a tent instead of at a table, listening to my mother's voice over a bad satellite connection, because that was the only version of home I could get that year. I paused, letting that settle, watching my father's eyes for the first time really focus on me, knew not on the version of me he'd built in his head, the daughter who came home twice a year with a duffel bag and a paycheck, but the person standing in front of him now. It represents friends. I continued, and my voice caught just slightly on that word, because some things don't get easier to say no matter how many times you've had to say them. People I trained with, people I led, people who didn't come home. I've written letters to parents who buried their kids at 23 years old. I've stood at attention while a flag was folded into a triangle and handed to a mother who couldn't stop shaking. That's what that money is. It's not luck. It's not a bonus for showing up. It's the weight of everything I've carried so that people in this country get to live lives where they never have to think about any of it. The kitchen was so quiet I could hear the clock above the stove ticking. I turned to Linda. So, when you tell your bank that you're helping me manage my account, I said, understand what you're actually doing. You're trying to put your hands on something that isn't yours to touch, and you're doing it without my permission, without my knowledge, and without any right to it at all. Linda's jaw tightened. I didn't mean any harm by it, Jennifer. Intent doesn't undo the fact that it happened 3 times, I said. The folder in Dad's office wasn't an accident either. Someone photocopied documents that weren't theirs to photocopy. Someone wrote down account numbers that weren't theirs to write down. My father's face had gone from pale to something closer to gray. I could see when it landed on him. Not just what Linda had done, but how much of it he had allowed, simply by never asking a single question. Tell your wife to stop touching my money, I said, still looking at him, my voice calm but absolutely unmovable. My money is mine, not hers, not yours, mine. I earned the right to decide what happens to it, and no one in this house gets to decide that for me because we happen to share a last name. Linda's composure finally cracked just slightly, a flash of something defensive crossing her face. You make it sound like I'm some kind of criminal. I'm not the one who called a bank pretending to be someone else, I said. That's not a sound, that's a fact, and there's a recording of it. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. It wasn't confusion anymore. It was the silence of two people realizing that whatever quiet arrangement they'd built over the years, whatever assumptions they'd made about what I would eventually give in and provide, had just been permanently closed. She needs to know where the line is, I said, my eyes still on my father because I won't be repeating this conversation. I looked at Linda one final time, and I kept my voice level controlled the way I would speak to anyone who needed to understand that a warning was not a threat. It was simply information. Cross that line again, I said, and this won't stay a polite conversation. My father's hands were trembling slightly at his sides, though I don't think he realized it. He looked at me the way you look at someone you thought you knew completely, only to discover an entire structure underneath them that you never noticed. Was there a foundation built out of discipline and independence and years of learning how to stand entirely on your own? For the first time since I'd walked back through that front door, I watched my father truly see me. Not the daughter he remembered from summers at the lake. Not the little girl who used to fall asleep on his shoulder during long car rides. Someone else. Someone who had built a life strong enough that no one, not even family, could quietly take pieces of it without her noticing. I turned and walked upstairs, leaving both of them standing in that kitchen with the weight of everything I'd said, settling into the space between them. Behind me, I heard my father finally speak, his voice low, uncertain, directed at Linda. What else have you done that I don't know about? I didn't stay to hear her answer. I already knew I would need more than words to understand the full truth of what had been happening in that house. I didn't sleep much that night, but it wasn't the restless kind of sleeplessness that comes from anger. It was the focused kind, the kind I've learned to use rather than fight against. By 4 a.m, I had a list. Every account, every document, every date. I could remember Linda asking a question that seemed casual at the time, but read very differently now. I've run intelligence briefings with less preparation than what I put into that legal pad before the sun came up. At 8, I called an attorney I'd used years earlier to help draft my will before my second deployment, a woman named Dana Whitfield. Sharp, unsentimental, exactly what the situation required. I told her everything. The folder in my father's office, the login attempts, the recorded call. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and then she said something I've held on to since. Jennifer, this isn't a misunderstanding between family members. This is a pattern, and patterns don't happen by accident. She asked me to send her copies of everything I had, and within 2 days, her office had pulled together a fuller picture than I think even I was prepared for. It turned out the folder was only the beginning. Over the past several years, Linda had opened at least 2 pieces of mail addressed to me that had been mistakenly delivered to my father's housebank correspondence. I never saw statements I assumed had simply been lost in the shuffle of changing addresses so often. On one occasion years earlier, she had submitted a form to update mailing preferences on an old account of mine, adding her own email as a secondary contact. It hadn't worked, not fully, but it had left a digital footprint the attorney's office was able to trace. There was also a life insurance policy I'd taken out at 26 back before I fully understood how such paperwork a soldier accumulates without meaning to. On one revision years ago, someone had attempted to list an additional beneficiary. The attempt had been rejected by the insurance company for lacking proper authorization, but the request itself was still on file, dated, time-stamped, undeniable. None of it had succeeded. Not the bank, not the mail, not the insurance form. But success was never really the point. The point was the pattern. Years of quiet, patient attempts to insert herself into the financial architecture of a life she had no legal claim to. I sat in Dana's office with the document spread across the table, and for a moment I let myself feel something other than discipline. I felt tired, not from lack of sleep, but from the particular exhaustion of realizing that the person supposedly caring for your father, sharing his home, sitting across from you at holiday dinners, had spent years treating your future like an inheritance to be quietly managed before you were even willing to admit it existed. I confronted Linda that evening. My father presented the documents laid out on the same kitchen table, where she'd once asked me how big my bonus was. She looked at the papers for a long moment before speaking, and when she finally did, her voice had lost the confidence it carried during our first conversation. "I just thought," she said slowly, "that eventually everything would be shared. That's how it works in families, Jennifer. What's yours becomes ours over time. I wasn't trying to steal from you. You don't have to intend to steal something, to still be reaching for it without permission," I said. She looked at my father, maybe hoping he'd soften the moment, the way he always had before, but he didn't say anything. He sat very still, staring at the insurance form with his own daughter's signature, forged in an attempt at a place it was never meant to be, and I watched something in him break quietly, privately, in a way I don't think he expected in front of either of us. "No," I said before Linda could try again. "That's exactly why you'll never have access. Not now, not later, not when Dad's gone, not when I'm gone. This ends here." I had Dana's office finalize everything in the week. Every account restructured, every document reissued under new authorization, every possible point of access permanently closed. I updated my will. I removed any lingering paperwork that connected my finances to my father's address. I built piece by piece a wall that no amount of patience or persistence would ever get through again. Linda didn't argue with the final decision. I think by that point she understood there was nothing left to argue. What surprised me more was my father's silence. It's not the same silence from before, the one that avoided conflict, but a different kind. The silence of someone finally doing the math on 15 years of small, quiet compromises, and not liking the sum he arrived at that night. As I packed away the folder of old documents to take with me, my father knocked softly on the guest room door. He didn't come in. He just stood in the hallway, looking older than I remembered him, looking just a week earlier. "I didn't know," he said. "I swear to you, Jenny, I didn't know how far it went." I looked at him for a long moment. I thought about my mother, about the man he used to be before grief made him easier to lead than I ever thought he could become. "Me. I believe that you didn't know everything," I said quietly. "But you knew enough to ask questions you never asked." He didn't have an answer for that. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, neither did I expect one. For 3 days after that conversation, my father barely spoke at dinner. I noticed him watching Linda differently, not with suspicion exactly, but with the careful attention of a man rereading something he thought he'd already understood, completely looking for the parts he'd skimmed past the first time. On the 4th day, he asked to borrow my laptop for an hour. I didn't ask why. I already suspected what he was looking for, and I wasn't going to stand in the way of him finding it himself. He came to my room that evening, with his own laptop open, his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, his face carrying an expression I hadn't seen on him since my mother's funeral. The look of a man forced to confront something he would have given almost anything to keep believing wasn't true. "I went through our email," he said, sitting down slowly on the edge of the bed like his legs weren't entirely sure they wanted to hold him up. "Years of it. I wanted to see if I was missing something, or if I was just being paranoid, and I asked, though I already knew the answer was going to hurt him more than he expected." He turned the laptop toward me. There were emails going back nearly 6 years. Linda writing to her sister, to an old friend from her book club, even once to a financial advisor she'd apparently consulted without my father's knowledge. In nearly every message, my name appeared somewhere, always in the context of money, my salary, my hazard pay, my retirement contributions. In one email dated almost 4 years ago, she'd written a line that my father read aloud in a voice that shook slightly at the edges. "Eventually, she'll help us retire. She doesn't have kids. She doesn't have anyone else to spend it on. It's not selfish to plan for that." I didn't say anything. I let the words sit in the room. Let them do the work I didn't need to do myself. My father closed the laptop gently, like it had suddenly become something fragile. I thought she loved you, he said. I really believed that. Maybe she did in her own way, I said. But loving someone and viewing them as a resource aren't the same thing, Dad. You can do both at once. People do it more often than you'd think. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. I keep thinking about your mother, he snorts, finally said. She never once asked you for anything. Not when things were tight, not when the roof needed replacing. And we were living paycheck to paycheck those last 2 years, before she got sick. She used to say, "The two of you built each other up, not off each other." I felt something tighten in my chest at that. A grief I don't often let myself sit with, because grief and discipline don't mix well in the field. And I've spent so long training myself not to feel things at inconvenient times that sometimes I forget how to let them arrive at all. She would have hated this, I said quietly, not because of the money, because of what it says about how easily people can convince themselves that taking is the same thing as caring. My father nodded slowly, and for the first time I saw something in his face that looked almost like shame. Not performative, not the kind people wear to move a conversation along faster, but real quiet shame, the kind that sits with a person long after the moment that caused it has passed. "Vinny, I should have asked more questions," he said. "Every time she brought up your finances, some part of me knew it wasn't right. But it was easier to let it go. It was easier than admitting my wife might be doing something I couldn't defend." "That's the part I need you to understand," I said, and I kept my voice gentle, because I could see how much this admission was costing him. Even if gentleness wasn't something I owed him yet, it was never really about the money. "Dad, it was about you choosing comfort over protecting me. Every time you said there's no harm done, you were choosing peace in your house over the truth in front of you." He didn't argue with that. He simply sat there absorbing it, the way soldiers absorb news they know is true, but wish desperately wasn't. Before he left the room that night, he turned back at the door. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. "Tell me and I'll do it." "I don't need you to do anything for me," I said. "I've already protected myself. What I need is for you to decide what kind of marriage you're willing to live inside of. Now that you know what's actually been happening in it." He nodded once, and I watched him walk down the hallway toward the room he shared with Linda, his shoulders carrying a weight I don't think he'd let himself feel in years. 2 days later, he came to find me again, this time with something different in his hands. A small leather folder I recognized instantly. My mother's folder. The one with her handwriting still visible on the tab. The one I hadn't seen since the year she died. "I want you to have this," he said, placing it gently in my hands. "I should have given it to you a long time ago. I think I was holding on to it because it was easier than letting go of her completely. But it belongs with you now, not locked away in a drawer where someone else could get their hands on it." I opened the folder later that night alone and found photographs I hadn't seen in over a decade, a handwritten letter my mother had left for me that I'd never had the strength to read before, and a small note just for me in handwriting I would know anywhere in the world. "Protect what you build, Jenny. Not because people don't deserve kindness, but because kindness without boundaries is how good people get taken advantage of by people who call it love." I sat there for a long time after reading it, the letter trembling slightly in my hands, understanding for the first time that some lessons don't come from training manuals or leadership courses. Some of them come from the people who love you enough to warn you, long before you ever need the warning. My last morning at my father's house arrived quieter than I expected. I'd packed the night before the way I always do, methodical, unhurried, everything folded into my duffel bag with the same precision I'd use preparing for deployment. Because habits like that don't turn off just because you're only driving back to base instead of flying overseas. My father was already in the kitchen when I came downstairs, sitting at the table with a small box in front of him. Linda was nowhere in sight, and I didn't ask where she'd gone. Some conversations are better without an audience, even when the audience is technically family. "I wanted to give you these before you left," he said, sliding the Clear's throat box toward me. Inside were the last of the documents. I'd never fully reclaimed my original birth certificate, an old social security card, house keys to a place I hadn't lived in since I was 18, and a folder of financial paperwork going back years. Everything Linda had ever touched now returned in full. I went through everything, he said. All of it. I made sure there was nothing left anywhere in this house that wasn't accounted for. I looked at the box for a long moment before picking it up. Thank you, I said. And I meant it. Even though gratitude and forgiveness aren't the same currency. And I wasn't prepared to spend the second one just yet. I should have protected you, my father said, his voice low, steady in a way I hadn't heard from him in years. Your whole life, I should have been the one standing between you and anyone who tried to take advantage of what you built. Instead, you had to do it yourself the same way you've done everything else yourself. I set the box down on the table and looked at him. Really looked the way I'd learned to look at people over the years past. What they say and into what their silence costs them. You should have respected me, I said quietly. Protection is what you do for someone who can't do it for themselves. I could always do it for myself, Dad. What I needed from you wasn't protection. It was respect. It was you asking questions when something didn't sit right, instead of choosing whatever kept the peace in your house that day. He nodded slowly, and I watched something settle in him. An understanding that had taken far too many years and far too much damage to arrive. Linda came downstairs just as I was zipping my duffel bag. She stood in the doorway for a moment, and for the first time since I'd arrived 2 weeks earlier, she looked genuinely uncertain, the confidence gone from her posture entirely. Jennifer, she said, I am sorry. I don't expect you to believe that right away, but I am. I turned to face her, and I kept my voice level, the same voice I'd use addressing anyone who needed to hear something clearly without room for misinterpretation. I believe that you're sorry you got caught, I said. Whether you're sorry for what you actually did, that's between you and whoever you answer to. But I want to be clear about something so there's no confusion moving forward. She waited, and I let the silence stretch just long enough to make sure she understood the weight of what was coming. Forgiveness doesn't restore access. I said I might someday find a way to forgive what happened here. That's a process I'll work through in my own time, on my own terms. But forgiveness and trust are two entirely different things. And trust is something you don't get to demand back just because enough time has passed. Linda didn't argue. I think by that point she understood there was nothing left to argue with. She simply nodded quietly and stepped aside to let me pass. My father walked me out to my carrying my duffel bag, even though I told him I could manage it myself. Some habits, I suppose, take longer to unlearn than others, and I decided that particular one was one I could let him keep. At the car, he hugged me longer than he usually did, and when he pulled back, there were tears in his eyes that he didn't bother hiding. I love you, Jenny, he said. I know that doesn't fix what I let happen, but I need you to know it's true. I know it's true, I said. Loving someone and protecting them aren't always the same thing, Dad. That's something I think we both learned this week. I got into my car, started the engine, and looked at him one last time through the window before pulling out of the driveway. He stood there in the yard, hands in his pockets, watching me go the way he used to watch me leave for basic training all those years ago. Except this time, I don't think he was worried about what I was heading toward. I think for the first time he understood exactly what I was heading back to, and exactly what it had cost me to build a life sturdy enough to survive people, trying to quietly take pieces of it. Driving back to base that afternoon, I thought about everything that had happened over those 2 weeks. The folder in the office, the recorded call, the emails, my mother's letter waiting for me in a box I never thought I'd get back. And I thought about something I'd tell any young soldier under my command if they ever needed to hear it. People think the Army pays us to carry a rank. They're wrong. It pays us for discipline, for sacrifice, for responsibility carried quietly day after day, whether anyone's watching or not. And there's one lesson I had to learn outside the military, somewhere no training manual ever prepared me for. Sometimes the hardest boundary to defend isn't the one on some distant border guarded by fences and checkpoints and rules of engagement. Sometimes it's the one inside your own family. The one nobody warns you'll have to build yourself brick by brick, out of nothing but your own quiet resolve. If this story meant something to you, if any part of it reminded you of a boundary you've had to defend in your own life, I'd love to hear about it. Leave a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. We've got so many more stories like this one to share with you every single day, so make sure you subscribe. That way, you never miss a moment like this one. Let's keep this journey going. 3 hours after my husband threw me out into the freezing night, the phone in his kitchen rang, and it wasn't me on the other end. It was a detective. She told him his wife was lying in a hospital bed, with a gash on her head, and that a gray SUV had been seen speeding away from where she fell. Elijah would walk into that hospital room expecting to find a liar. Instead, he'd find a truth he never let himself see coming. But before any of that, there was a locked door, a porch light going dark, and a man I'd loved for 18 choosing his son's word over mine. I was 50 years old, standing on my own front porch, in a thin wool sweater, watching my husband turn the deadbolt from the inside. The snow came in sideways under the porch, light stinging my cheeks, while Caleb stood behind him with the calm, satisfied posture of a man who just won a war I didn't know I was fighting. "Go, Ava," Elijah said through the storm door, not even opening it all the way. "I don't want to see you until the money's back." "You actually believe I stole from you?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "I believe my son." 5 words. 18 years, and it came down to 5 words. It was the last night of January, and the temperature had dropped well below freezing. I had on a sweater, slacks, and the flats I wore around the house, nothing more. My phone, my wallet, my coat, even my blood pressure medication were still inside, sitting exactly where I left them that morning. Caleb had gathered my things from around the house earlier that evening and locked them in our bedroom, telling his father I was getting ready to run. That a woman who wasn't planning to disappear wouldn't need her passport within reach. Elijah believed him. He gave me 10 minutes to leave and wouldn't let me back in for my phone certain. I'd use those minutes to erase evidence of something I hadn't done. I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I told Elijah as calmly as I could manage with my teeth, starting to chatter, that the bank was already investigating irregularities on the account, that I was the one who'd reported them. Caleb cut in before I finished the sentence. "Don't let her stall, Dad. She's been doing this for weeks." I looked at my husband's face in the porch light and understood in that instant that he had already reached his verdict. He hadn't asked me a single fair question. He'd simply handed down a sentence and expected me to serve it. I stepped back off the porch before he could call the police and claim I was the one causing a disturbance. The door locked behind me with a sound I felt in my chest more than heard. Standing there in the cold, I thought about all the years that had led to this moment. I thought about the winter. I helped Elijah dig himself out of debt after his first divorce, back when he had nothing but a leased apartment and a 14-year-old son who barely spoke to him. I thought about sitting in an emergency room at 2:00 in the morning when Caleb broke his leg at 16, holding his hand while he cried, long before either of them called me family in any way that counted. I thought about the semester of college tuition I quietly covered so Caleb wouldn't have to drop out, and the jewelry, my mother's jewelry, that I sold without telling Elijah, so the dealership wouldn't go under during the recession. None of it mattered now. A folder of doctored paperwork and a few well-placed sentences from Caleb had erased 18 years in a single evening. I started walking toward the gas station roughly a mile down the road, the only place I knew would still be lit at that hour. The wind cut through my sweater like it wasn't there. My flats filled with snow within the first few hundred yards, and I could feel my feet losing sensation, that dull ache turning into something worse. I kept my arms wrapped around myself, and my head down, counting mailboxes to keep my mind from spiraling. Somewhere past the 3rd or 4th house, I heard an engine accelerate behind me. Headlights swept across the road, too bright, too fast for a quiet residential street at that hour. I turned instinctively, some old instinct from my fraud investigation days, telling me to get a look at the vehicle. And that's when my foot caught a patch of black ice. I went down hard, my temple striking the curb. The last thing I saw before the world tilted and went dark at the edges was a gray SUV idling a short distance away, its tail lights glowing red against the falling snow. Something about the shape of it, the dent along the rear panel, was familiar in a way that made my stomach drop even as consciousness slipped from me. It looked exactly like Caleb's car. I don't know how long I lay there in the snow. The last thing I remember is a woman's voice, sharp with panic, shouting for someone to call 911. 3 hours later, the phone rang in my husband's kitchen, but the police weren't calling to ask if he wanted to come bring his wife home. They were calling because they needed him to come identify what was left of the story he thought he knew. To understand how I ended up alone on that road, you have to go back 6 weeks to the day Caleb showed up on our doorstep with 2 suitcases and a story about a tech company that had laid off half its staff. He said his girlfriend had left him. He said he just needed a few months to get back on his feet. I looked at Elijah's face when he asked if his son could stay with us, and I said yes, because I loved my husband, and because I remembered what it felt like to watch someone you love struggle without anyone catching them. I didn't know yet that I was the one who'd be caught. Within the first 2 weeks, I noticed things. Caleb took phone calls in the backyard, pacing, his voice dropping whenever I came near a window. He asked more than once in that offhand way people use when they're testing the water what the house might be worth if we ever sold it. I found him in Elijah's office more than once, thumbing through folders that had nothing to do with him. He suggested gently at first, then less gently, that his father should add his name to the deed, just in case anything happened. He told Elijah when he thought I wasn't listening that I'd gotten controlling over the years, that I liked keeping my husband dependent on me. I spent 11 years investigating insurance fraud before I became a risk consultant, and old instincts don't fade. I started noticing the kind of details that used to build a case file. A bank email showing a login from an unfamiliar device, a request to transfer $85,000 into an account tied to a shell company I'd never heard of. A photocopy of Elijah's signature sitting in the printer tray, practiced several times over like homework. Quint, an audio editing app, installed on Caleb's laptop that had no business being there. Payments flowing out to a sports betting site from an account registered under Elijah's dealership. I didn't confront him. Confrontation, in my experience, only teaches a liar to hide better. Instead, I quietly reported the irregularities to the bank's fraud division. I photographed the device history before it could be wiped. I called Detective Naomi Price, someone I'd worked alongside years earlier, and asked her off the record what I should be documenting. I brought copies of everything to Linda Chen, my attorney of almost 2 decades, and asked her to keep the investigation in quiet so Caleb wouldn't have a chance to destroy what I'd found. What I hadn't accounted for was how quickly he'd notice me watching. Caleb realized I was building something against him, and rather than run, he decided to get ahead of it. He built his own story, and he built it well. He created a fake email made to look like it came from me and sent it to a local real estate broker inquiring about a quick sale. He printed up a draft contract with my name typed at the bottom. He took a screenshot of the pending transfer request and cropped it so it looked like a completed transaction, rather than Clear's throat, a request still frozen in the bank's verification queue. He took my father-in-law's watch out of the box in my dresser drawer, a watch I'd sent out for repair 3 weeks earlier, with a receipt sitting in a drawer in my office to prove it, and left the empty case behind for Elijah to find. The worst of it was the recording. I'd had a phone call with Linda about setting up a clear medical power of attorney in case Elijah ever had another dizzy spell like the one that sent him to urgent care that spring. What I'd actually said was, if Elijah becomes unable to make decisions for himself because of a stroke, we need a clear medical power of attorney in place. Nita Caleb ran it through some kind of editing software and cut it down to 11 words. Elijah will no longer have the right to decide. We need power of attorney. Stripped of context, it sounded like a woman plotting to take control of her husband's life. Caleb took that lie to his father in pieces, never all at once. Always at moments when Elijah was tired or vulnerable. "I don't want to break up your marriage, Dad." He'd say, soft and reluctant like a son forced into an unwanted role. But maybe she's been planning to leave for a while now. He knew exactly which wound to press. Elijah's first wife had drained a joint account and vanished with another man years before I ever entered the picture, and Elijah had never fully healed from missing the signs. Caleb used that old scar like a lever. "You didn't see it coming last time," he told his father one night when I was upstairs and couldn't hear the exact words, only the tone. "I just don't want it to happen again." The night it all came to a head, Caleb laid the folder out on our kitchen table, like a prosecutor presenting a closing argument. Elijah confronted me, but he wouldn't let me see the full contents, only the pieces Caleb wanted him to see. I tried to explain that I was the one who'd reported the bank activity in the first place. Caleb didn't miss a beat. "Of course she'd say that. The person who gets caught always claims to be the one who found it." Elijah asked about the sale contract. I told him truthfully that the house couldn't be sold without my signature on it. Caleb turned my own words into a weapon. "Hear that, Dad? She just said the house is hers." That was the moment Elijah learned for the first time in our marriage that his name had never been on the deed. His face changed. Not anger, exactly. Something closer to humiliation. The particular sting of learning something in front of your own child that you should have known for years. I tried to explain the timeline that I'd bought the house before we married, that it had nothing to do with trust or lack of it. He wasn't hearing me anymore. He was hearing 18 years rearranged into a story where he was the fool. What stays with me most thinking back on that kitchen table isn't Elijah's face. It's Caleb's in the half second before his father turned to look at him for confirmation. Not anger, fear. I understood it clearly only after I was already lying in the snow. Caleb hadn't simply wanted me out of the house that night. He needed me away from my phone and my computer before whatever he had planned could unfold without interference. The woman who found me was named Mary Ann Foster, a 62-year-old retired nurse driving home from her sister's house when her headlights caught something dark against the white shoulder of the road. She told me later that she almost mistook me for a fallen branch, that it was only the shape of an arm against the snow that made her slow down. She pulled over. She called 911 before she even got out of the car. She kept an emergency blanket in her trunk, the kind she'd carried for 30 years out of old nursing habit, and she wrapped it around me while she waited for the ambulance, talking to me the whole time, even though I couldn't answer her. She noticed a gray SUV pulling away from the area, its taillights disappearing around the corner without stopping, and some instinct told her to memorize part of the license plate. Before it vanished. She wrote it on her palm and pen because she didn't trust herself to remember it otherwise. At St. Catherine Medical Center, Dr. Samuel Reed diagnosed me with mild to moderate hypothermia, a mild concussion, a laceration at my temple that needed stitches, and an irregular heartbeat brought on by the cold and the stress on my system. He wanted me monitored for several hours before he'd consider releasing me. I remember surfacing slowly, the fluorescent lights too bright, the beeping of a monitor keeping time with my pulse, and the first coherent thought I had was to ask what time it was. The second was to ask someone to call Detective Naomi Price. Naomi arrived within the hour. She recognized me immediately. We'd worked the same insurance fraud case years earlier, back when I still carried a badge instead of a consulting fee. She didn't hug me or fuss over me. She pulled a chair beside the bed and asked me to tell her everything in order, starting with the moment Elijah locked the door. I told her. Elijah had thrown me out. Caleb had taken my phone. The vehicle at the scene might have been Caleb's. Caleb knew I'd been quietly working with the bank's fraud division, which meant he had a reason to want me isolated that night. Naomi didn't leap to conclusions. She told me plainly that it was entirely possible the SUV near the accident was a coincidence, that grief and fear have a way of making people see intention where there's only bad luck. But the fact that Caleb's vehicle had been in the vicinity, and that whoever was driving hadn't stopped for a woman lying unconscious in the snow, was something that needed to be looked at, regardless of intention. The evidence started coming in fast after that. Mary Ann provided the partial plate number from memory. Knee footage from the gas station down the road showed a gray SUV matching Caleb's passing by, within minutes of my leaving the house. Automated license plate readers confirmed the vehicle had circled back through the neighborhood before leaving again. The bank called to report that someone had just attempted to log into the flagged account and cancel the fraud investigation altogether. The login traced to a device registered to Caleb. With the risk that evidence could be deleted at any moment, officers moved quickly to secure an emergency warrant for his devices. Naomi called Elijah herself. I could only hear her side of it from the hospital bed, but it was short, deliberate. "Mr. Morgan, this is Detective Naomi Price. Your wife is at St. Catherine Medical Center." I heard the tinny panic through the phone even from a few feet away. "The hospital? What happened?" "She was found unconscious on the side of the road, suffering from hypothermia." "You need to come now." He asked, apparently whether I was pressing charges against him. Naomi's response was flat. "You should be worried about whether she makes it through the night safely." Caleb tried to keep him from leaving. I only learned the details afterward, but Elijah told me. Caleb argued that I was staging the whole thing, that I'd deliberately put myself in danger to make him feel guilty, that the police might be trying to bait him into incriminating himself, and he ought to call a lawyer before going anywhere. Elijah said something in Caleb's tone that night finally struck him as wrong. Too calculated, too rehearsed for a son worried about his father. "How do you even know your stepmother was in an accident?" Elijah asked him. Caleb hesitated, then claimed he'd overheard it during the phone call, but Naomi had never used the word accident. Elijah arrived at the hospital not long after. As he approached my room, he saw two officers standing outside, a representative from the bank's fraud department, and Linda Chen, my attorney, already seated near the nurse's station with a folder in her lap. On a small table near the doorway sat his father's watch, sealed inside a clear evidence bag. He walked in slowly. He looked at me, the white bandage at my temple, my skin still pale from the cold, the IV taped to the back of my hand, and something in his face cracked open. Then Naomi stepped forward and placed a printed still frame from the gas station camera on the table in front of him. Elijah looked down at the image, at the driver behind the wheel of the gray SUV. His face went the color of the snow outside the window. "No," he said so quietly I almost didn't hear it. "This can't be happening." Elijah stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like a full minute, before he made himself walk toward the bed. I watched him take inventory of me, the way you'd survey damage after a storm. The bandage at my temple, the pallor in my skin, the IV line taped to the back of my hand, the plastic hospital bag on the chair holding my soaked, ruined sweater. He noticed my feet last, the faint frost nip along my toes, and something in his expression buckled when he understood what that meant. He had sent me out into a blizzard without a coat, without shoes fit for weather, without so much as my phone to call for help. "Until Ava," he said. I didn't know. "You knew it was snowing," I said. I kept my voice even. There was no use raising it. Some truths land harder when they're spoken quietly. Naomi stepped closer and held up the printed still frame again, walking Elijah through what it actually showed Caleb's SUV near the spot where I'd fallen, time-stamped only minutes after I'd left the house. She was careful, professional, unwilling to overstate what the photo could and couldn't prove. It didn't show intent. It didn't prove he'd meant to run me off the road. But it proved he'd been there. It proved he'd seen me. It proved he hadn't stopped, hadn't called for help, and had gone home afterward and told his father he'd never left the living room. Elijah shook his head almost reflexively. Caleb was home with me. Naomi laid out the plate reader data beside the photograph, the timestamps lining up like a ledger that left no room for argument. I watched my husband's certainty crack in real time, watched him arrive slowly and against everything he wanted to believe at the same conclusion he'd spoken in the doorway. "No," he said again. "This can't be happening." Then Linda took her turn. She explained in the calm, unhurried tone she used with juries that I'd sent Elijah's father's watch out for repair 3 weeks prior. She had the receipt. The jewelry shop had security footage of the drop-off, time-stamped and dated with my signature on the intake form. "Caleb," she explained, had gone to the shop afterward and picked it up under false pretenses, claiming to be retrieving it on his father's behalf. He'd left the empty box in my drawer for someone to find at exactly the right moment. Officers had since located the watch itself, hidden in a compartment beneath the driver's seat of Caleb's car. I watched something shift behind Elijah's eyes. The folder Caleb built wasn't evidence. It was a stage set. The bank's fraud representative spoke next, laying out the transaction Caleb had used as his centerpiece. I hadn't withdrawn $85,000. I'd reported the suspicious request myself, days before Elijah ever saw a printed screenshot. The transfer had originated from Elijah's old tablet, a device he rarely used anymore. The verification code meant to confirm the transaction had been rerouted to a prepaid phone number linked to Caleb. The receiving account belonged to an LLC Caleb had registered using an old friend's name to keep his own off the paperwork. Elijah couldn't look at me directly anymore. He kept his eyes on the folder Linda had brought, as if staring hard enough might rearrange the facts back into the shape he'd believed that morning. He tried weakly to explain that Caleb's evidence had seemed convincing at the time. He said he'd only meant for me to be gone one night. He said he'd planned to come find me himself in the morning. I asked him the only question that mattered. "You turned off the porch light while I was still standing on it. Where exactly did you think I was supposed to go?" He didn't have an answer for that. I hadn't expected one. I want to be honest about something here, because I think it matters more than the drama of the reveal itself. I didn't forgive him in that hospital room. I didn't feel a wave of relief wash the anger away just because the truth had finally surfaced. Caleb built the lie, yes, but it was Elijah's hand on the deadbolt. It was Elijah who chose not to ask me a single question before passing judgment. I said as much to him plainly without raising my voice. "The Caleb built the lie, but you're the one who opened the door and pushed me out into it." He had no response to that either. Some silences say more than any apology could. Naomi's phone rang before the moment could stretch any further. She stepped a few feet away to take the call, her expression sharpening as she listened. When she came back, she told us the search team had gone through Caleb's room at the house. What they found went beyond anything any of us had expected. A copy of the deed to our house, my name circled in pen like a problem to be solved. Sheets of paper covered in Elijah's signature, over and over, until it was nearly convincing. Draft contract transferring ownership of the house into Caleb's name. An unsent email to a lending company, still sitting in the drafts folder. And beneath all of it, a life insurance policy newly issued $750,000 written on Elijah's life. The sole beneficiary was Caleb. Elijah's signature was on that policy too. It was forged just like everything else. Naomi laid it out for us the way she must have laid out 100 cases before mine. Careful not to speculate beyond what the evidence actually supported, Caleb hadn't set out simply to steal $85,000. That figure was only the opening move. The plan, once you saw all its pieces lined up together, had 4 stages. First, convince Elijah that I was the one betraying him. Second, get me out of the house and cut off my access to my phone and computer before I could interfere. Third, persuade Elijah to sign over financial power of attorney, framed as a way to protect himself from a wife who could no longer be trusted. Fourth, use that authority to borrow heavily against the house and the dealership. What Caleb hadn't accounted for was the ground he thought he was standing on. The house was never Elijah's to mortgage. I'd bought it in 2002, years before Elijah and I ever met, and my name alone remained on the deed. The equity Elijah had contributed over the years existed under a separate financial agreement Linda had drawn up early in our marriage, protecting both of us. The dealership carried debt I'd conditionally guaranteed, and Linda already had documents prepared to revoke that guarantee the moment fraud was confirmed. Caleb had built an elaborate scheme on top of a foundation that had never belonged to him. Naomi played the full unedited recording of my call with Linda, the one Caleb had cut down to 11 damning words. In the original, I was talking about setting up a clear medical power of attorney after Elijah's dizzy spell that spring. "I want Elijah to keep making his own decisions for as long as possible," my recorded voice said. The power of attorney should only take effect if he loses the capacity to think clearly for himself. Caleb had sliced off the first half entirely, leaving only a sentence that sounded like a woman scheming to strip her husband of his rights. Hearing the full version played back in my own voice, in that sterile hospital room, was its own kind of vindication. It didn't feel like triumph. It felt like exhaustion. The financial picture that emerged from the search was staggering. Caleb owed more than $140,000, spread across 3 private lenders who didn't extend the kind of patience banks did. He'd used dealership paperwork as collateral without Elijah's knowledge. One lender had given him a week to produce $60,000 or face consequences he clearly didn't want to describe to police. He believed with the kind of desperate logic debt produces that mortgaging our house would solve everything. Dour. There was resentment, tangled up in the desperation too. 3 months earlier, I'd refused to hand him cash to cover a gambling debt. I'd told him calmly that I'd pay for treatment for a real program, but I wouldn't fund the habit itself. I'll pay for you to get help, I'd said. I won't pay for you to keep betting. He'd told his father afterward that I hated him, that I wanted him gone from the family entirely. It wasn't true, but it was useful. And Caleb had never been shy about using whatever was useful. Sitting in that hospital bed, I found myself walking Elijah back through years of warning signs he'd chosen to explain away. Caleb taking his father's credit card without asking, lying about finishing his degree, borrowing money from his aunt, and then denying it to her face. A car accident while driving under the influence that Elijah quietly paid to settle rather than let his son face any real consequence. You didn't protect Caleb, I told him. You taught him that every consequence could be paid off by his father. I watched that land harder than anything else I'd said all night. Harder than the forged signatures. Harder than the insurance policy. A man can absorb evidence of a crime more easily than he can absorb the idea that he built the person capable of committing it. Linda brought out the deed to settle the last piece of confusion. I'd purchased the house in 2002. Elijah moved in 2007. We married in 2008. His name was never added, not out of secrecy, but because he was still working through financial obligations from his first divorce when we married, and timing never seemed to matter enough to revisit. I'd once suggested drawing up a lifetime right of residency for him, ensuring he'd never lose his home, no matter what happened between us. The paperwork sat unsigned for years because he kept putting it off. I hadn't used the house as leverage or as a weapon. I'd used it quietly as the one piece of ground beneath me that no one could take. I made a few decisions that night, and I said them plainly, without softening them for anyone's comfort. Elijah wouldn't return home while the investigation was active. He could retrieve personal items only with an officer present. Caleb was barred from any access to the property. I would begin the process of revoking my guarantee on the dealership's fraud-tainted debts. And the marriage itself, that decision would not be made tonight, under fluorescent lights, with stitches still fresh in my scalp. Elijah asked me quietly not to end things. You ended my sense of safety the moment you locked that door, I told him. Everything after that is mine to decide in my own time. Naomi stepped back into the room before he could respond, her expression tighter than I'd seen it all night. Caleb, she said, had gone back to the house. Doorbell camera footage showed him in the garage, pouring gasoline, attempting to burn a box of documents in a metal bin. Officers were already on their way. Elijah's face drained of whatever color the hospital lights had left in it. His son wasn't simply trying to erase evidence anymore. He was prepared to burn down the house itself. In the same breath, he'd once claimed he was only trying to protect. Officers reached the house before the fire in the garage could spread past the metal bin Caleb had been using. What they found there closed the last gaps in the case. Gasoline, torn copies of bank statements, a laptop with its screen smashed in, as though he'd tried to destroy it with his bare hands, a prepaid phone, the forged contract transferring ownership of the house, threatening text messages from at least one of his lenders. The kind that made it clear his week to produce $60,000 had already run out. Caleb was arrested that night. The charges that followed were serious, though careful: identity fraud, forgery, unauthorized access to financial accounts, evidence tampering, and destruction of property by fire. Naomi was honest with us about the accident on the road. The footage showed Caleb slowing near where I'd fallen, and driving on, which supported a charge of leaving the scene, but there wasn't enough to prove he'd deliberately tried to hurt me. I appreciated that honesty more than I can say. It would have been easy for the story to tip into something cleaner and more satisfying Caleb as an outright attempted killer. But that wasn't what the evidence showed, and I didn't want a version of the truth stretched past what actually happened. I was released from the hospital 2 days later, still weak, still moving carefully around the stitches at my temple. Elijah and I both attended Caleb's initial hearings, sitting several rows apart in a courtroom that smelled like old wood polish and nerves. Caleb looked smaller than I remembered, stripped of the composure he always wore like a second skin. He spoke to his father first, his voice pitched low, urgent. "I did all of this to protect you from her." Elijah's answer came out flat, by letting her freeze to death in the snow. Caleb denied it immediately, insisting he'd only followed me to make sure I left the neighborhood, nothing more. Naomi had already shown us the footage of his car slowing as it passed me on the road, and then continuing on without stopping. He didn't have an answer for that timestamp, and for a moment his composure slipped enough that I saw briefly the frightened man underneath the performance. He turned to me next, some of the old coldness returning to his face. "That house was supposed to belong to this family. I was your family for 18 years, I told him. You only remembered that word when you wanted something from it." Elijah faced his own reckoning in that courtroom hallway afterward. Caleb, given one last chance before being led away, begged his father to cover his bail the way he'd covered every consequence before. It was in its own way the final test of everything I'd said to Elijah in that hospital room. For the first time in 18 years, he said no. "You need to face what you did," he told his son. Caleb's composure cracked entirely then, and he turned the blame outward, accusing me of taking his father from him. Elijah's response surprised me more than anything else that day. "No," he said. "You're the one who showed me the man I'd let myself become. It wasn't forgiveness, not for me, not yet. But it was the first real sign of a man beginning to take responsibility for the shape of his own choices, rather than handing the bill to someone else the way he always had." Linda spent the following weeks untangling the financial wreckage. Caleb had no legal claim to the house. That much had never been in question, but it was formally permanently confirmed. His name was removed as a beneficiary from every account and trust connected to Elijah. I bore no responsibility for the debts he'd accumulated using the dealership's name. The business itself would need restructuring, but Linda had shielded most of it from the forged paperwork before real damage was done. My own assets, the house included, remained entirely separate and untouched. The larger question, what happened to my marriage, took longer to answer. Elijah asked to come home to start over, to try to rebuild what 18 years had apparently not been enough to protect. I didn't answer him right away. Instead, a few days later, I handed him an envelope. Inside was a legal separation agreement, a temporary arrangement for dividing our belongings, a list of what he could take from the house, and tucked behind the legal paperwork information for a 6-month lease on a small apartment across town, the first month already paid, so he wouldn't find himself without a roof over his head in the middle of winter, regardless of what he'd done to me. He looked at the folder for a long moment before he spoke. "After everything I did, you're still helping me. I don't want you dying out in the cold," I told him. "That's the difference between us." I meant it as a simple fact, not a performance of virtue. Some people confuse mercy with weakness. I've never believed the two were the same thing. He looked down at the separation papers again, and I watched him search for something to say that might change the outcome. "Is there any chance for us?" he finally asked. "Not for the marriage we used to have," I told him. I didn't say more than that. I hadn't decided yet whether anything else might exist on the other side of what we'd both survived, and I wasn't going to manufacture false hope just to soften the moment for him. Some doors close permanently. Others simply need time before you know which kind you're standing in front of. 6 months passed before the last pieces of that winter finally settled into place. Caleb accepted a plea deal with the prosecutor rather than risk trial. He was sentenced to a fixed prison term, along with financial probation and a restitution order that would follow him for years. As part of his sentencing, he entered a mandatory gambling addiction treatment program inside the facility. The incident on the road never became a criminal charge in itself. There wasn't enough evidence to prove intent to harm, but his decision to leave me, unconscious in the snow rather than stop, was formally noted in the sentencing record. A permanent mark on the story of who he'd chosen to be that night. Elijah sold his stake in the dealership to satisfy the legitimate debts Caleb's scheme had left behind, and he began living more simply than he had in years. He started attending a support group for parents of adult children struggling with addiction, something I hadn't expected from him, but was quietly glad to hear about. Me. Our divorce was finalized in early summer. I made my own decision about the house not long after. I didn't hand it over to charity in some grand gesture the way stories like this sometimes end. I'm not interested in performing generosity I don't fully feel. Instead, I sold it. I couldn't picture myself continuing to live in the place where my own husband had locked me outside in a blizzard, no matter how many good years had happened there. Before that night, with part of the proceeds, I bought a smaller house near Lake Erie, close enough to hear the water some mornings when the wind was right. With another part, I started a legal aid fund for women over 45 facing financial abuse within their marriages. Women who often discover the way I did, that the people who are supposed to protect them can just as easily become the ones who need protecting from. I named the fund after my mother, not after myself. She was the one who taught me long before any of this happened that dignity isn't loud. It doesn't need an audience. It just needs to be true. Elijah came to see me at the new house once near the end of that summer to return an old set of keys that no longer opened anything of mine. He stood on the porch for a moment before I invited him in, and I noticed he didn't try to push past that invisible line the way he once might have. I thought locking you out that night was protecting our family, he said. Family doesn't need to be protected from the truth, I told him. He apologized for more believing Caleb. He apologized for not asking me a single question before making up his mind, for not trusting 18 years of history over a folder full of lies, for choosing his own comfort that night instead of my safety, for using a snowstorm as a punishment. I accepted the apology. I want to be honest about that because I think it matters. Accepting an apology isn't the same as inviting someone back into your life. I told him as much. Forgiveness doesn't come with a key, I said. He nodded like he understood, and then he left. I watched him walk back to his car from the window, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel after everything. Not triumph, not even relief exactly. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that only comes after a long time of not having any. That evening snow began to fall again, light and unhurried, settling over the new walkway the way it had settled over the old one 6 months earlier. But this time was different, and I noticed every part of the difference. I had a warm coat on. My phone was in my pocket, fully charged, mine, to use however I chose. My keys were in my hand, not locked away in someone else's decision. I was the one who would decide tonight, and every night after, whether that door stayed open or closed. Marianne, the woman who found me in the snow that night, and never once asked for anything in return, came by for dinner with a few of my friends. I opened the door and let them in out of the cold, the sound of their laughter filling a house that had never once belonged to anyone but me. 6 months ago, a door closed behind me on the coldest night of the winter. I remember thinking in that moment that the sound of that lock turning was the sound of my life falling apart. I was wrong. It was the sound of a prison opening. Elijah believed his son's lies and put me out of my own home. It took the police, a hospital bed, and a stack of forged documents to show him the truth. But the truth that mattered most to me was never written on any of that paperwork. I don't need a man who only believes me once the evidence has been laid out in front of him. I need someone who believed in who I was long before any evidence became necessary. Outside, the snow kept falling over the new path to my door. I rested my hand against the frame, listened to my friends laughing behind me, and locked it not to keep anyone out, but to protect the peace that finally lived inside. This time the key stayed in my hand. I'd love to know what you think Ava's next chapter looks like. Drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from tonight. I read every single one. We've got so many more stories like this one waiting for you, so hit subscribe and don't miss a single moment. Let's keep this journey going together.